and they had put the Shah's son, the 11-year-old crown prince Ahmad of Qajar, on the throne under a parliament-approved regency. His father, meanwhile, was deposed and took refuge on the 17th at the Russian embassy, where he was granted asylum. For now, Muhammad Ali of Qajar vacated the throne and headed for Odessa, but he wouldn't stay out of the picture forever. The Khalat Bari prince would go on to be a national hero, immortalized under the title Sepadar Azam. The prince had already been the richest man in Persia prior to the revolution, and now he had the popularity to go with it, although he would later suffer a humiliating falling out with the future Pahlavi dynasty. It was nothing but a blip on the radar for his legacy. Jumping back to April, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company had been formed to take advantage of oil deposits discovered in the southern part of the country, in the British area of influence. No oil discoveries had as of yet been made within the Russian sphere in the northern part of the country. Oil was destined to play a huge role in the future of international relations within Persia. Meanwhile, a new true constitutionalism began to take hold in Persia, with the child king having very little authority and for the first time the parliament having a large say over the running of the country. However, the state they ruled over was a broken-down empire, riddled with foreign occupation and domestic strife. The young Shah's father knew this, and so did the Russians, who wanted to bolster the Persian state by clandestinely supporting the young Shah's father's attempt to win the throne back. However, as opposed to bolstering the Persian state, this was effectively tearing down the current Persian state, just as the revolutionaries had done to Muhammad Ali's regime the first time. In the summer of 1911, the ex-Shah returned at the head of an army of loyalists, with the intention of overthrowing the Khalat Bari prince, William Schuster, and his son, who was playing the role of collaborationist against him. During this crisis, the Khalat Bari prince had to resign as prime minister. He was then replaced within the cabinet of the constitutionalist government by the Prince of Bakhtiari. The pretenders' forces were driven back, away from Tehran, over the course of the late summer, and eventually the ex-Shah would surrender to his old government on October 8th. However, he fled back to Russia and continued his exile in Odessa before eventually ending up in Italy. Meanwhile, the Russians, who had been planning on recognizing his new government, now turned to the existing Tehran regime and presented it with a stark ultimatum. The Russians demanded that the Persians revoke Schuster's tax collection law and suspend the use of the gendarme to collect those taxes. In addition, they required Persia to issue a formal apology from the parliament to Russia and to its consulates in Tehran and Tabriz. This was seen as a set of outrageous demands in Persia. After 2 weeks without a response, the Russians severed diplomatic ties with Persia on November 18th. 5 days after that, the Persians did comply with the original ultimatum. However, the Russians were not satisfied, and they issued another ultimatum on November 29th. This presented the explicit demand to dismiss Schuster and evict him from Persia, and to immediately replace Schuster's gendarme units with Russian-friendly Persian Cossacks. It didn't take long this time for the parliament to reject this new set of demands. However, the Russians were not making empty threats. On December 19th, troops began pouring across the border, expanding the Russian military zone around Tabriz to include Persian Kurdistan and other parts of northwestern Persia. The Russians did take the opportunity to kick the Ottomans out of Kurdistan where they found them. However, the Persian border they restored was only for future use, because for now the Russian military occupied and administered that territory just the same as the rest of northwestern Persia. On the 21st, resistance began in Tabriz, a city that had been occupied now for several years, and the local forces briefly managed to expel the Russians from the city as they focused their advance elsewhere in the region. The Russians decided to continue their advance around the rebel stronghold and then exert any revenge they wanted to later when returning to mop up. With the Persian state in total crisis, and with the possibility of outright Russian invasion of the capital looming, the parliament resigned on December 24th. Or more accurately, it was dissolved by the cabinet with the hope that this would hold off further Russian advances. However, the appeasement tactic didn't work, and so the cabinet went further ousting Schuster from the country on January 11th. The American was replaced by a Belgian director of finance, while the Persian cabinet reluctantly signed the November 29th ultimatum, having now fulfilled its terms. However, on the same day, the Russians retook Tabriz, with brutal reprisals and other violent acts set upon the population by the Russian troops. They massacred civilians, raped women, destroyed buildings, and left decapitated bodies hanging from lampposts as a sign to all who may resist Russian rule. As the city of Rasht came under the same administration as Tabriz, it was also subject to vicious reprisals from the Russians. The Persian cabinet's capitulation to Russia had been too little too late, and the Russians punished the Persian government as well, murdering several Persian policemen during reprisals in Rasht. Just over 2 years later, Europe was embroiled in the early stages of World War I. On August 1st, 1914, Russia became involved, as Germany declared war on Russia back in Europe. As the men went marching towards Europe's conflagration, what was happening in Persia became of secondary importance. However, it didn't take long for the South Caucasus to become a vitally important region. On November 1st, the Ottoman Empire entered World War I, on the opposite side of the British and Russians. That placed the Ottoman Empire at odds with Russia, Britain, and their Persian client. In a lot of ways, this was just a continuation within a World War context of the rivalry that had already been going on for years over the South Caucasus and Persia. But now, despite Persia's neutrality, the great powers weren't just going to use the area to skirmish, they were going to use it to battle. Tabriz figured to feature prominently in the campaign in Persia. Ottoman Minister of War Enver Pasha made Tabriz the first goal of the Ottoman advance in Persia. However, Russia had their own target, and they had their sights set on the Ottoman city of Van. The Russians made the first move on December 10th, but the Ottomans hit back, initiating a series of offensives and counteroffensives between the two powers, trading Tabriz and Van on several different occasions. Now, Persia was officially neutral, however, they were receiving support from the Germans. Large segments of the legislature were pro-German, as the Persians had experienced so much trouble in recent years with the British and Russians. The Shah's gendarme units, pro-German and armed by Ottoman forces, began to strike back at the Russian occupiers, taking back swathes of Russian military territory. Within 2 weeks, the Russians had returned and occupied Tehran, with the British also invading Persia from the east. The pro-German members of the parliament fled Tehran and formed their own government in southwestern Iran under the protection of the Ottoman army. Meanwhile, the Russians returned some of the territory, including Tehran, back to the Shah, but still retained an occupation force in Tehran and points west, with the British occupying non-military controlled Persia to the east of Tehran. However, we only see the Russian forces because we're talking about Russia throughout this episode. But if we were talking about Britain, we would see some little blue dots to the right of Tehran, and if we were talking about the Ottoman Empire, we would see some little red dots in the rebel Persian state. However, within a year, the situation had changed drastically again. The Ottomans and pro-German Persian forces had recaptured much of Gilan and the Caspian coast. Again, the Russians had to withdraw, so the British temporarily took over protection of the Shah. However, they didn't have the forces to do that, so the Shah was left mostly unprotected. Meanwhile, the Russians were beginning to land troops, and within a month they were steadily approaching the capital. As the Russian forces bared down on Tehran, the remaining pro-German members of the parliament, who had not fled to the rebel government, proclaimed a coup against the Shah, who was forced to flee to the Russian consulate in the city. Meanwhile, the British had very little to no presence in the area and could do nothing to stop the coup, with the British who were present in Tehran also awaiting the arrival of the Russian army. The next day, the Russians entered Tehran and rescued the Shah, with the remaining pro-German parliamentarians having fled to the rival government. However, within 4 months, another Ottoman and Persian nationalist offensive had recaptured Gilan for the Central Powers. While Tehran was given another round of impotent British protection, the entire story was about to be flipped on its head back in European Russia. The February Revolution broke out in European Russia. It was February on the Gregorian calendar, which Russia still used at that point. The Tsar, Nicholas II, was cast off the imperial throne. His brother then abdicated the position, leaving the monarchy vacant, and a provisional government under Alexander Kerensky was declared. The Russian monarchy was not officially abolished at this point, and royal family members continued in their military service, as the provisional government was not backing away from the war, despite the fact that the Tsar's abdication had largely been caused by the war. However, in late April, members of the royal family were removed from their posts, and many Cossacks also started abandoning their positions. The Russians consulted with the British for support, but they couldn't spare much. Later that year, the British and Russians met with Kurdish tribal leaders within the rebellious Persian state in hopes of enlisting their support against the occupying Ottoman forces. On September 14th, the Russian monarchy was officially abolished, and the provisional government was renamed to a republic still under Alexander Kerensky's leadership. The war was increasingly unpopular, and there were fewer and fewer troops to fight it, as the royals, the Cossacks, and numerous other factions had abandoned the Russian army. The Ottomans' own weakness was the only thing keeping Russia in control of northwestern Persia and the Caucasus. However, chaos soon erupted in early November, October on the then Russian calendar, as the October Revolution took over European Russia. Communist rebels, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction, seized control of the Russian heartland. With Lenin's communist government now in control of Moscow, the so-called bourgeois Russian Republic under Kerensky remained in control of the Caucasus region and the occupied areas at this point. But just 4 days later, a drastic shakeup began. Under Russian leadership, the Azerbaijani, Armenian, and Georgian delegations to the Russian parliament declared their own commissariat autonomous from the Russian Republic. Now, at this point, they weren't officially ruling out reuniting with Russia in the future, but that didn't stop the move from helping to propel the Russian weakness in the region. Within a month, the Russian forces within Persia had mostly disintegrated, and those that remained were merged with those in Anatolia to form the forces of Western Armenia. Meanwhile, they officially handed control of northwest Persia and Tabriz back to the Shah's regime. However, the Shah had little practical control over the area due to being cut off by the Central Powers-aligned Persian state. The Russians clung to a presence across the Caspian Sea, while the Transcaucasians took temporary control of an Azeri-populated section of Persia. This was spurred on by the Azeri component within Transcaucasia, and this protective action for the locals was designed to be temporary in wake of the Russian evacuation. However, the Shah got some help from the British, who managed to push from their base in Iraq all the way up to Rasht on the Caspian coast. This was done by the Dunster Force, sent under General Dunsterville to try to gather support from both the Persian and Russian Cossacks, plus other factions that had been fighting alongside the Russians but had now laid down their arms. Dunsterville's force met resistance from the local communes that had taken power in rebel Persia, following their former Ottoman allies being driven west by the British. Meanwhile, communists were seizing power further up the coast. However, not communists from Moscow. Instead, Armenian communists seized control of Baku. After a multi-day struggle, they massacred the Azeri citizens and gendarmes alike. Meanwhile, the British and Russians were on their way to assist in the fight. However, the commune would persist. Despite several ceasefires between multiple different Russian governments, other governments in the region, and the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans began an offensive toward the Caspian, retaking Van once again, but now it was in the context of the Armenian genocide going on throughout the Ottoman regions. And the Armenian population of Van, which had held out for several years and survived the city changing hands multiple times, were now massacred by the Ottoman troops. So we're starting to see massacres occur on multiple different sides, from Christians, from Muslims, from communists. And the map is starting to look like a jigsaw puzzle. Across the Caspian, the Soviets failed to secure Bukhara, but they were able to get control of Khiva and the Caspian coast. This allowed increased support for Baku, who the next day completed their exodus of the Azeris and declared victory for the commune. At the same time, the Bolsheviks sent Cheka and other agents across the Caspian to take control of the commune and end the wild executions going on in Baku. The Red Army of Baku also engaged in an offensive. By the 16th of April, they had seized Lankaran, essentially making it an exclave of the Baku communists. On April 22nd, Transcaucasia ruled out Russia being a part of its future, disavowing both the Soviets, as they always had, but also the White Army's Russian Republic. Transcaucasia tabled the idea of reuniting in the future and became a federation of the national committees of the three constituent peoples. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was setting out to gather an army to capture Baku. They wanted local Azeris who felt alienated by the Baku commune and the slaughter of their comrades to take up arms against both the Armenian communists and the British, as well as potentially the Red and White armies. 5,000 alienated Azeris joined the force to go with 5,000 regular Ottoman troops. Meanwhile, General Dunsterville was busy rallying support for his potential offensive. The British wanted Dunsterville to defend Baku against the inevitable Ottoman assault. Dunsterville was also working with Cossacks and White Army staff, who some of the time posed as communists to help Dunsterville's cause. In Transcaucasia, the Georgians now took German support and declared their independence on the 26th. The Georgians had done a lot to keep the Federation together and to keep the Azeris and Armenians from fighting one another. Now with the Ottomans and Bolsheviks each splitting the Azeris and Armenians against each other, there was no way to keep the union together. 2 days later, Armenia and Azerbaijan proclaimed their independence. By June 5th, the Ottoman troops had arrived in Azerbaijan and were assaulting Baku, but the city's defenders held out. The Georgians were also participating in this offensive as they were aligned with the Germans. The Ottomans turned their attention south to Tabriz. The Army of the Caucasus seized Tabriz on June 8th, and a few days later had the remaining Cossacks in the area on the run. By June 17th, they had captured Urmia, and the Ottomans once again annexed the territory of this part of Kurdistan. The Ottomans now had a land bridge to Baku, and another assault seemed inevitable. Unbeknownst to the Ottomans, the Bolsheviks were bolstering the commune in Baku, and the Baku Red Army went on an offensive June 25th. The communists had the Army of the Caucasus on the retreat, and the commune was able to seize a sizable hinterland. But within a month, the White Army had retaken Khiva on the other side of the Caspian, cutting off Bolshevik support for the commune. On July 25th, the commune government voted to request British aid, so the socialist commissars resigned. The Proletarian Committee of Dictators under the Bolsheviks was now replaced by a bourgeois cabinet of 5 dictators, with the Baku government renamed the Central Caspian Dictatorship. Meanwhile, the Dunster force was now all ready to go, marching into northwestern Persia and retaking Urmia on the 28th of July. However, it was only a few days later when the Ottomans began their full offensive towards ultimately capturing Baku. On July 31st, they retook Urmia. In response to the advance, the British deployed their Cossack allies, setting them up in the so-called Provisional Military Dictatorship of Mugan. This is where the Russian forces would be based in the upcoming fight against the Ottomans, while the British would be based in Baku. By August 27th, the Ottomans and company had surrounded Baku. Meanwhile, the British had subdued Mirza Kuchik Khan's government in Rasht, which had been swaying between the Ottomans and the Soviets depending on who was stronger. The Ottomans and their allies began the shelling of Baku, which continued all the way through September 12th, as the Ottomans tightened their grip around the city. The British, not wanting to get into a losing battle, wanted to leave. However, Baku convinced them to stay, with Dunsterville's force remaining until all hope was lost. However, on September 13th, the Ottomans began the final offensive, and the next day, defeat was imminent, and the British and their Russian allies fled the city, abandoning it to Ottoman and Azerbaijani control. The Christians and communists, who made up most of the Armenian population of the city, was massacred on the streets as payback for the genocide of Azeris back in March under the communist dictatorship. While this took place alongside the simultaneous Armenian genocide, these particular actions were more Azerbaijani revenge for what had happened in March. And of course, the Turks were only too happy to play along at this point. The Azeris then went to war with Armenia on their western flank. With Ottoman help, they took half the Republic of Armenia, the region called Nakhchivan after its princes. However, the Christian Armenians pushed out the Azeris by October 17th, as the Ottomans were engaged in fierce fighting and no longer had troops to spare. The Ottomans themselves were under grave threat by the end of the month, and on October 30th, the Ottomans signed the Armistice of Mudros, ending the fighting. This armistice saw the British and Ottomans abandon their occupied territories and reset the Persian-Ottoman border to where it had been prior to World War I. The Qajar dynasty, despite being now just little more than a figurehead, regained control over northwest Persia. 2 days later, Azerbaijan renounced its relationship with the defeated Ottomans, yet the Azeris were going about other methods of accomplishing their goals. They had allies in Nakhchivan set up a puppet republic known as the Aras Republic, nominally independent but again a puppet of Azerbaijan. With Armenia threatening to invade Aras, by January 27th, the Azeris had secured the republic with military force, while still letting it remain independent. Meanwhile, on the Caspian coast, a rebellion sprang up against Cossack forces who had tried reorganizing their control of the area into a civil territorial administration. However, it was still subject to the overthrow on April 25th. A Soviet government was declared in its place. This remained the status quo through the early summer. However, by July 30th, Armenia had taken back Nakhchivan, and Soviet Lankaran had changed its name to the Mugan Soviet Republic. However, on this day, the Azeris invaded, and on the 31st captured Lankaran. By February of the next year, Soviet Russia was back in control of the eastern Caspian. On the 16th, British forces, which had been bolstering the Shah's government after the surrender of the Ottomans, left Persia. But just like the Russians, the British wouldn't be gone forever. On April 9th, the Sheikh Mohammed Kiabani, an intellectual cleric in the typical Tabriz mold, proclaimed the city and its